My name is Jenny, and I've always lived with a condition that defined much of my childhood and shaped the way I view the world quite literally. By day, I could see, though not as clearly as most people. I had trouble focusing on small details, and bright lights often strained my eyes, but I managed. However, at night, my vision would vanish entirely. It was as if the world disappeared, leaving me in complete, terrifying darkness. This wasn't just the natural difficulty of seeing in the dark. For me, it was absolute blindness. My world would go pitch black the moment the sun set. No shadows, no outlines, no glimmers of light, just endless darkness. My parents told me I was born this way, though it wasn't until I started school that I realized how different I was. Other children would play outside late into the evening, chasing each other and laughing under the moonlight. But I would sit on the sidelines, unable to join them. I'd pretend I wasn't interested, but deep down, it hurt. I felt isolated, trapped by my own body. "Why can't I see at night like the other kids?" I asked my mother once. I was 6 years old, and the question had been gnawing at me for a while. She crouched down and cupped my face in her hands. "Jenny, sometimes life gives us challenges, but you're brave, and I know you'll find your way," she said. Her words comforted me, but they didn't change the reality of my situation. Over time, I learned from doctors that my condition could be treated with surgery. The hope lit a small spark in my heart, but that spark was quickly extinguished when I overheard my parents talking about how expensive the treatment was. We were poor, living hand to mouth. Surgery was a luxury we couldn't afford. My father, who worked tirelessly to provide for us, would often say, "Jenny, one day I'll save up enough for your treatment. Just wait and see." His optimism gave me hope, even when times were tough. But life has a way of shattering even the strongest hopes. When I was 7 years old, my father fell ill. It started as a persistent cough, something he dismissed as nothing serious. But it quickly worsened, and within weeks, he was bedridden. We didn't have money for proper medical care, and before we knew it, he was gone. I didn't fully understand what had happened at the time. I kept waiting for him to come home, to hear his cheerful whistle as he walked through the door. But he never did. The house felt unbearably empty without him. My mother was devastated, though she tried to hide her grief for my sake. With my father gone, life became a daily struggle for survival. My mother took on every job she could find, cleaning houses, mending clothes, even working in the fields. But no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. There were nights when we had nothing to eat, and I could hear her crying softly in the next room, thinking I was asleep. One day, a kind neighbor suggested something that shocked both of us. "You should remarry," she told my mother. "You're still young, and Jenny needs stability. You can't do this alone forever." At first, my mother dismissed the idea outright. "I could never marry anyone else," she said. "My heart belongs to my husband, But as months passed and our situation grew more desperate, she began to reconsider. She wasn't thinking about herself, she was thinking about me. Eventually, she met David, a widower whose wife had died of illness. David seemed kind and soft-spoken. He promised to take care of us and provide a stable life. Reluctantly, my mother agreed to marry him. I was 18 at the time, old enough to understand her decision, but still unsure about having a stepfather. At first, things genuinely improved. David moved us into his home, which was much larger and more comfortable than our old house. For the first time in years, we didn't have to worry about where our next meal would come from. My mother seemed happier, and I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were looking up. But as time went on, I began to notice things about David that unsettled me. He wasn't unkind, but there was a coldness to him. He rarely spoke to me directly, and when he did, his tone was curt and distant. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that I just needed time to adjust to this new life. Then, one night, something happened that changed everything. I had gone to bed as usual, wrapping myself in my blanket and letting the darkness envelop me. My room was completely still, the only sound being the faint creak of the wooden beams as the house settled. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard the door to my room creak open. At first, I thought it was my mother checking on me. "Mom," I called out softly, but there was no response. I felt a presence in the room, standing near the foot of my bed. My heart began to race. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. Still, there was no answer. After a few moments, the figure turned and left, closing the door softly behind them. The next night, the same thing happened. This time, the figure came closer to my bed. I froze, too scared to move. I could hear their breathing, shallow and deliberate. They stood there for what felt like an eternity before leaving without a word. By the third night, I was terrified. I decided to pretend I was asleep, hoping they would go away if I didn't react. But instead, the figure entered the room and sat down on the edge of my bed. I felt the mattress sink under their weight, and then they reached out and touched my face. Panic took over. Without thinking, I bit down on their hand as hard as I could. The figure yelped in pain and quickly left the room. I heard their footsteps retreating down the hallway, and then all was quiet. The next morning, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I told my mother everything, sparing no detail. She listened with wide eyes, her face growing more and more troubled as I spoke. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long time before saying, "I'll take care of this." Later that day, when David came home, I noticed a fresh wound on his hand. My stomach turned. My mother saw it too and asked him how he had hurt himself. He stammered, fumbling for an excuse, but it was clear he was lying. That's when it all clicked. My mother's face hardened, and without a word, she slapped David across the face. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Get out of my house, and don't you dare come near my daughter again." David tried to protest, but my mother wouldn't hear it. She packed our belongings, and by the end of the day, we had left his house and returned to our old home. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The neighbors, upon hearing what had happened, rallied around us. They helped my mother set up a small sewing and embroidery shop, providing her with the tools and materials she needed to start over. It wasn't easy, but we managed. Slowly, life began to improve again. Looking back, that experience taught me so much about resilience and the strength of my mother's love. She protected me when I couldn't protect myself, standing up to someone who had betrayed her trust in the worst way. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. I can still hear the sound of the door creaking open, feel the cold touch of that hand on my face. Every time I think about it, my skin crawls. But I also remind myself of how far we've come since then. Today, my mother's shop is thriving, and I help her as much as I can. I've learned to find joy in the little things and to appreciate the strength it took for us to rebuild our lives. While I'll never forget what happened, I refuse to let it define me.